The state of Israel, according to international law, is no longer a member state of the United Nations, which is occupying disputed, undefined territory. The state of Israel, a member of the United Nations, is occupying another member state of the United Nations, which automatically, by the United Nations Charter, calls for a new Security Council resolution that by definition has to use Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which empower the United Nations to send peacekeeping troops to Palestine to facilitate the withdrawal of Israel from the Palestinian state and to provide security guarantees for both states. Now, the Security Council resolution will have to specify what the boundaries are. It will have to specify the parameters of peace. I've drafted the Security Council resolution, and I've sent it to the Secretary General for him to see. Basically, what it says is that the state, according to the parameters that we know, the state of Palestine will be based on the June 4th, 67 borders with agreed upon mutual territorial swaps. Jerusalem will be the capitals of both cities, divided according to demography, et cetera, et cetera. The parameters of peace are spelled out in the Security Council resolution. Now, before I get into the fact that it won't be implemented, there is a poetic justice that the body which is responsible for creating the state of Israel and the partition plan is the body that we're going back to for the international legitimacy for the resolution of this conflict. UN Resolution 181, the partition plan, created a state of Israel, and the Arab state, the Palestinian state, has not yet been created. So it's appropriate to go back to the United Nations to bring about the full creation of the Palestinian state. Now, the government of Israel will not agree. It will object to this process. But the major difference in Israel that we will have is that we, in civil society, will have for the first time since the beginning of the peace process a credible international supported plan that we can rally around and rebuild a peace movement, rebuild a peace camp. Because it's no longer about giving land to the Palestinians who are going to use that land to shoot us. There's an international plan for sending peacekeeping troops there who will guarantee not only the security of the Palestinian state, but will guarantee the security of the state of Israel. The Palestinian state will be under the responsibility of the international community to ensure that it's not a base for terrorism, but it's a base for building peaceful relations between the two states. On the Palestinian side, what I suggest to them is that they need to, under this framework, call for new elections, but not new elections for a Palestinian authority, elections for the government of the state of Palestine. And a prerequisite for participating in those elections, like in any state, is that you recognize your state. And if Hamas does not recognize the state of Palestine, according to the UN Charter and its desire to live in peace with all of its neighbors, and chooses not to participate in elections, the Palestinian people will punish Hamas for doing so. And if they do agree to participate, then Hamas is no longer Hamas. We create a whole new situation. So these are different ways, different things that can be done. I could put down 10 more plans.
Wow. Do you think the problem with the people talk about UN and they take over Jerusalem is that they cannot trust the UN, use peacekeepers?
But the UN is the international community. A peacekeeping force, and a lot more work needs to be done on this, a peacekeeping force is going to be led by the United States. There will not be US troops on the ground. There will never be a US military personnel, a soldier, and is an American soldier facing an Israeli soldier. This will never happen. But the multinational force in Sinai is headed by a US general, and the executive branch of the force is American, and the troops are others. So the troops will be European and Russian and Turks. There'll be French troops and Italians and Swedes and Swiss maybe, Norwegians and Russians and Turks and who knows who else. But the whole thing will be led by the Americans, which will create the trust. It doesn't have to be a blue helmet force under the UN. It can be a multinational force like the force in Sinai, or whatever we call it. The principle is set within the framework.
There are successful forces. I think the UN forces, I think that they let Rwanda, they just...
There was no force, no UN force for Rwanda. There were Swedish, there were Dutch observers in Srebrenica, in Bosnia, but there was no UN force there. There is a UN force today in Kosovo, a NATO force, I think it is actually. But there are other models, and there's enough models that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and create something that will be better, that will make its own mistakes, but it'll be better. Yes?
I'm sorry that I was late. Have you talked about the Goldstone?
I didn't.
We would love to hear your perspectives on the cause of the war.
Okay.
Yeah.
We turned down the heat.
Yeah.
I didn't mean the heat of the questions. I think that
Close the doors so you can stay there.
I think it was a very big error of the State of Israel not to cooperate with the Goldstone Commission. But I don't know if I said this. I've spoken so many times over the last week, so I don't know what I've said where.
You have not mentioned Goldstone.
Okay. So I've been interviewed about 100 times on the Goldstone report. And I had to preface every interview by saying I haven't read it. And the interviewers told me, don't worry, no one else has. I read it. It has not prevented anyone from speaking about it. So I, in fact, printed out the Goldstone report and carried it with me on the plane over here, and I've been reading it, and I'm almost finished with it. So I hope you can say that I've almost read it all. But it's very clear in reading the report that the mission, the report keeps on saying, we asked the government of Israel this, and we asked the government of Israel that, and we wanted information and responses from the government of Israel on what happened in this place and what happened on that place, and we had no cooperation. Not only that, we wanted to interview victims of Qassam rockets in Sderot, and we had no access to Israel. We could not enter Israel and interview the Israeli civilians who were victims of Hamas attacks against Israel. Two people, I think one person, went to Geneva to testify, but they had no access to go and visit in Sderot. They also had no access to go to the West Bank and meet with the Palestinian Authority leaders there, who have their fixed opinions about Hamas as well, who are more in line with what Israel thinks of Hamas than what some of the international community thinks. So I think that's a very big mistake. The second thing is that once the report was issued, the report requires Israel to do one thing, and only one thing, and that's to establish an independent investigation to respond to what the report accuses Israel of doing. My response to that is, as an Israeli citizen, I demand from my government to set up an independent commission headed by a Supreme Court judge or a retired judge in order to exonerate us from the war crimes that we're being accused of committing. If my state, my government, my army committed war crimes, as a citizen of Israel, I demand to know. And I demand that investigation to be undertaken by the State of Israel on my behalf, not on the behalf of Goldstone. And I think this is essential, and I think that we as Israelis have to raise our voice on this. And I'm not getting into the question of if the committee was automatically against Israel, or if Goldstone hates Israel or loves Israel, or if the report's mandate was too wide or too narrow, or whatever it may be. I agree with Judge Goldstone that the Human Rights Council in Geneva made a mistake when they sent the report to the General Assembly with only mention in the resolution of Israel's war crimes and not the war crimes of Hamas. Judge Goldstone was very angry about that, and I agree with him. But we have a responsibility as a state. Now, I think that Israel does, in fact, have one of the most moral armies in the world. But no army, be it the most moral army in the world, can investigate itself. So I reject the Israeli behavior on the question of the Goldstone report.
Just so people know, there's a House resolution coming up, number 867. Do people know about that?
No.
It's essentially a resolution supporting Israel and asking that the UN not consider the Goldstone report. So email your representatives to tell them not to do it, to oppose House Resolution 867.
This is AIPAC is behind that resolution.